Welcome back, class. I want to take this video to give you a very brief introduction to the really to talk about the historical roots of World War I, and just give you a brief sort of idea of the mindset, to talk about how this is possible, why it happened. As I'll talk about in the next lecture video, World War I, probably one of the most pivotal events in history, certainly characterizes and defines the 20th century as a whole. But World War I, like any historical event, doesn't happen out of thin air. It's not like it just magically occurs. And you're probably have been taught that World War I is a result of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and we'll deal with that in the next lecture. But the setup here, the reason why World War I happens, has deep roots in the 19th century, even into the 18th century, and these roots deal with what we talked about. If you can think back all the way to the beginning of class, when we talked about the Age of Discovery, we talked about the expanse of the European nations, moving into particularly South America, eventually into North America. What we were really talking about there is colonialism, is the rise of European nations as economic powers, and the reason why these nations are becoming so powerful is that they're starting to take over other parts of the world. Now, this takeover isn't always a physical takeover. It's not like we're always talking about when we talk about the English, the mass movement of English people into North America. Sometimes it's just the sort of economic takeover, if you want to think about it that way. That has never stopped. So we've taken a break from that to talk about the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and all this other stuff that's happening. But that continuous expanse, that continuous expanding of European powers overseas, has been going on this entire time. But by the beginning of the 19th century, things look a bit different. So when we talked about the Age of Discovery, we primarily talked about South America, Central America, and North America. And during that time, Spain and Portugal were the primary European players there. As you remember, England and France are a bit late to the game. Now that's kind of reversed, okay? By the during the 19th century, you have various Latin American revolutions. These Latin American countries start to rebel against the Spanish Empire, and Spain as a superpower is sort of on its way out. It's going to fight a number of wars in Latin America, including a war with America, but it's nowhere near as powerful as it used to be. Portugal is going to start losing. Remember, the Portuguese Empire, primarily a trade empire, controlling the East Indian Company, controlling trade to and from the Pacific Ocean, connected to those trade routes in India. It's going to lose much of that to the English. Really, the 19th century is the rise of England as the world's premier naval power. And because it's the world's premier naval power, it's going to have a solid grip on world trade, especially trade to the Pacific. So England and France are really going to start increasing in power. So much so that by the end of the 19th century, England and France combined control about 75% of the world. Okay, the entire world. England, by the end of the 19th century, is probably the largest and one of the most powerful empires that has ever existed in history. Rivaled only, as far as like sheer land mass, by Russia. That's also, by the 19th century, is going to be the largest that it's ever been. And so Latin America, many Latin American revolutions, France is really losing control, Spain is really losing control there. Portugal is losing to the English. England and France and Russia are going to start competing, and Japan are going to start competing for control of Asia. Japan's really interesting, and we won't really have a whole lot of time to talk about it. I'll mention Japan throughout the World War I and World War II lectures. But Japan is the only non-European empire, period. Okay? Japan is starting to become an empire by the end of the 19th century, it's a full-fledged empire. But Japan is going to start competing with France and England for its piece of the pie in Asia. This is really going to kick off after the Japanese and the Russians go to war at the beginning of the 20th century. Japan actually wins, which is a major reason why Russia is getting involved in the First World War. But during the 19th century, Japan is starting to expand. It's adopting the European model. It's expanding its provinces. Again, Japan's an island. It's expanding its territories solely in Asia. So Britain and France splitting China there. The exact same thing is going to happen with what happened in Latin America and South America and Central America. In the 19th century, the exact same thing is going to happen to Africa. You're going to have all of the major European powers, specifically France and Britain, but also, and we'll talk about this in our World War I lecture, but by the mid-19th century, Germany is united. It actually becomes a state. It becomes the German state as opposed to Prussia, these various German provinces controlled by random princes. Germany is united. Germany is the latest imperial power, and really the only place left for it to conquer is Africa. So Germany, France, Britain start competing for control of Africa. It's the scramble of Africa. It results in the Boer Wars in southern Africa between Britain and Germany. But there's just a lot of competition going on. And all of this is fueled by the sort of intellectual developments that are taking place at this time. The 19th century is also the rise of nationalism. Nationalism, the belief that my state, my country is the best country, right? You go, you ask a little kid, you go to any one of the preschools and you say, what's the best country in the world? They'll say America, right? You go to Switzerland and you ask another little kid, what's the best country in the world? They'll say Switzerland. It doesn't matter how poor the country is, how terrible it's doing. Everyone believes that, well, my country's got to be the best, right? And nationalism is this pride in one's country, sort of linked with patriotism. In the 19th century is really the rise of nationalism. Now, nationalism as a concept has its roots all the way back, really to the 100 Years' War between France and Britain in the 15th century, but that doesn't really concern us too much here. This nationalism is sort of propped up by certain philosophical, political ideas that are happening. I'll briefly mention one. It's indirectly, for example, okay, in the 19th century you have a German philosopher named Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's a bit of a strange guy. He has really kind of weird beliefs that we don't really have to get into because we probably wouldn't be able to explain it. Very complicated philosophy. But Hegel has a pretty interesting idea of history. And this is how it goes. It's pretty straightforward. So Hegel says history progresses by the collision of opposites. So you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, those historical forces meet, they clash, and out of that collision comes a synthesis. It's a combination of the two. And that this is kind of what pushes and moves history along. It's hard to see, probably his best example, one of his most historically accurate examples, Hegel says, for example, in the first century, you have first century Judaism, and then you have first century Greek philosophy. They collide, they clash, and out of that collision, they form a synthesis. That synthesis is Christianity. That's pretty strong. Christianity does have its roots in those things, but you can sort of see that history is this constant progression, and it's a result of this collision between opposites that form this new thing. And this new thing is constantly driving history forward and forward and forward. And you can kind of view history, according to Hegel, as a pyramid, that we're progressing, progressing, progressing. And Hegel believed that European civilization in the 19th century, Hegel's right in the 19th century Germany. Hegel believes that 19th century Germany is sort of the pinnacle of human history. They're the best of the best. That all of human history is leading up to 19th century Germany. Now that might sound a bit ridiculous to you, and it is, but this is kind of the prevailing attitude, the thought process of people in the 19th century. European civilization is considered the height of civilization. There is no, you look all throughout history, you look at Greece and Rome and whatever, whoever you want to look at, European civilization is the pinnacle of human existence. Right? All of history is, we're the best of the best. Right? And this is, in some ways, all of this has a racial component to it, because these places that these European countries are conquering, again, Japan is the exception here, but even in Japanese history, there's a racial component, is the belief that whatever country is doing the colonizing, whether it's Britain, France, or Japan, or Russia, or Germany, that we are better than the people that we're colonizing. We're more advanced. And in many ways, the belief is, well, we're actually doing them a favor, right? Remember when we talked about the Native American, we're bringing them civilization, right? We are making you better simply by us being here, type deal. And this is combined in strange ways with Darwinism, something we didn't talk about, something I'm very interested in. But Darwinian evolution is used incorrectly as a way to justify these sort of racial biases, that not only has human civilization progressing, but the human race is progressing, and that Europeans sort of represent the pinnacle of that. Now, biologically, we know that's just bogus. It's bullshit. It's not true, right? But this is the mentality going into it. And so it's this constant competition. Well, we'll get to competition, but it's this constant desire, right? We have a right to the world. We have a right to conquer the world, really. So, yes, it is about money, first and foremost, right? It's always about money. But there's also this mindset, right, that we're the best. We in some way deserve this. We're the pinnacle of civilization. It's a sort of a way to morally justify their actions. Well, this constant expansion, of course, leads to further competition, right? Because the Europeans, these nations are never satisfied with what's happening. And so eventually what's going to happen is that these countries, France, Britain, and especially Germany, is going to start to clash over colonial interest. And these collisions, these small little minor wars are going to start adding up. And these European nations, again, this competition, they're constantly looking for a way to one-up the other person, constantly looking for a way to get ahead. And that's going to provide the root for World War I, for the conflict. By the end of the 19th century, most European nations expect to go to war. They're ready for it. They've been doing all this other stuff overseas. They've been preparing at home. Most of them know that it's coming. Some people don't want it to happen. Other people do. But there's this sort of feeling in the air that eventually, and probably sooner rather than later, we're going to war. But a very dangerous aspect of this has already happened that I need to mention before I end. is what happens with Napoleon. Okay, so we didn't really talk about the French Revolution all that much. French Revolution happens after the American Revolution, happens late 18th century. Once the French revolt, right, the French Revolution, if we remember, is about the overthrowing of monarchy. It's different from the American Revolution. The American Revolution, really an economic revolution. We want our economic independence from Britain, right? That's the American Revolution. The French Revolution is a rejection of monarchy as a valid form of government. We no longer want a monarch. Okay? The great irony of the French Revolution is that in order to escape everybody declaring war on them, so once the French revolt, all these other European nations are monarchs. They don't like what they're seeing, so they declare war on France. To save them, they need to elect a good military commander. Napoleon Bonaparte sort of rises through the ranks. Eventually Napoleon this is the irony, is elected Emperor of France. Eventually they just say, Napoleon, you know what you're doing, we'll put you in charge. Well, Napoleon does something very interesting. Most militaries at this time are, you do have professional armies, troops that are constantly paid to fight, but you also have large mercenary armies, people that are just paid for short periods of time and then go to another nation and fight for another nation. Napoleon's army isn't a professional army. Okay, Napoleon gets his army from the people, from the population. Okay, so warfare's changing with the introduction of rifles and gunpowder and all this other good stuff. But Napoleon's going to take a interesting approach. He's basically going to do the first enlistment. He's going to just start the first draft. Sorry, the first draft. He's just going to start drafting just hundreds of thousands of people from the population. Napoleon's army is a people's army. It's not a professional army. It's a people's army. But the dangerous thing is that the people fighting believe in what they're fighting for. And the death toll of the Napoleonic Wars is going to be something that Europe has never seen before. Napoleon, for example, is one day meeting with a British commander, and the British commander says, I've already spent 30,000 men in this war. He's already he's spent 30,000 men. They've given up their lives. And Napoleon supposedly remarked, I spend 30,000 men a month. Okay, so Napoleon's base, his supply, and this is one of the change in mindsets. You're no longer viewing these people as soldiers. You're starting to view them as commodities. They're a resource. So Napoleon creates the first people's army, and the other European nations are watching this. They see how effective it is. So when World War I rolls around, the population levels, the amount of people in these armies is utterly staggering. No one had ever seen anything like this before. And that, combined with the advancement of technology that we've sort of been talking about in the background of this class, inventions such as rifled weapons, which we see really introduced in the Civil War, the Gatling gun. We now are going to start seeing heavy artillery and eventually the use of gas weaponry. Hundreds of thousands of men put into the field with really untested weapons. As we'll see in the next lecture, it's going to have a disastrous effect, disastrous consequence. The loss of human life on a unimaginable level. Alright, that's it for this lecture, guys. I'll see you next time and we'll talk about World War I.